Good afternoon. As mentioned, I'm a professor. I teach user experience design at Kent State University. This is about an hour from Cleveland, Ohio. But don't let any of that frighten you. I'm Canadian. And when I grew up in Canada, I studied physics. I studied engineering physics. And when I did that, I remember very clearly my professor telling us a story about when he was a young physicist and how he learned to do physics. It was a story about an internship that he had one summer. He went to the National Research Council in Ottawa. He was assigned a room with a senior physicist, and every day he would go in and he would sit down. He would sit down and he would pull out his piece of paper and he would pull out his pencils and he would work really hard all day. It was the late 1950s. Computers were things that filled rooms. Everything got done on paper and pencil. The senior physicist would come in every day with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. And he would sit there and he would crack that newspaper and he would sit down and lean back and he would sip his coffee. And when he was done with the paper, he would put it aside and he would put his hands behind his head and he would lean back, stare at the ceiling, and think. He would think deep thoughts, and he would think deep thoughts all day with his feet in the air, his hand behind his head. Meanwhile, my professor, as a young student, was sitting there going and scribbling mad and thinking, I must be doing something wrong, right? I mean, this is weird. This doesn't really make any sense, because this didn't go on just one day or 2 days or even a week. This went on for a month. And every day he would come in, and this person who's making a lot more money than he is just sitting back like this. And then one day, in the middle of the afternoon, he put his hands down and said, I've got it. Pulled out the pad of paper and the pencil and scribbled away, and did that for the rest of the summer. This is the story that I was told as a young student who wanted to be a physicist. The message of the story was clear. Thinking deep thoughts in your head, that's where the hard work is done. And over the last 20 years, I have come to believe that this is rubbish. It is absolute garbage. We do not think this way at all. And Richard Feynman, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, along with Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking, didn't think so either. When his biographer asked him to show him his notes and explain how he did his work, the biographer pointed and said, well, there's the work right there. And Feynman said, well, I actually did the work on the paper. Well, the work was done in your head, but the record of it is still here. No, it's not a record, Feynman said. It's working. You have to work on paper, and this is the paper, okay? This is where the actual thinking happens. And this matters for us because we are building the digital future. And the current world that we live in is pretty thin when it comes to how we interact with information, how we interact with the digital world, and how it supports what goes on up here. And this is not a new idea. Douglas Engelbart, whom you probably know as the person who invented the mouse and just about every other thing in terms of our digital world, in his landmark report, Augmenting Human Intellect, the very first sentence reads, by augmenting human intellect, we mean increasing the capability of a man to to approach a complex problem situation, to gain comprehension to suit its particular needs, and to derive solutions to problems. These are tools for thought. So, my question. A question that I think we should be asking is, what is thinking? And it's an old question, but what is it? Many people have asked this question. Back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, that question was asked by a group of people that we came to know as behaviorists. And the idea of behaviorism was that the mind could not be known. There were inputs and there were outputs. You could change what went in, and then you looked at what went out, but everything that happened inside the mind was a black box. This is the work of B.F. Skinner, and today behaviorism is alive and well. It's in all those apps to make you not eat too much, or to make you run more. All the stuff about changing your behavior. That was behaviorism, right? And in the extreme form, the mind was literally unknowable, so unknowable that you couldn't even know your own mind and what went on. This led to a famous joke. Well, famous in academic circles, right? Two behaviorists make love, and after they're done, the one says to the other, well, I know it was good for you, but how was it for me? Now, after behaviorism came cognitivism, cognitive science. And the idea of cognitive science was different. The idea of cognitive science said, we can know how the mind works if we're clever. If we design certain kinds of inputs, and then we design the study to look at the outputs in a particular way, we can infer how the mind works. We can understand the mental operations. That's cognitive science. And you know, if you look at it, cognitive science leads all the way into human-computer interaction, and human-computer interaction leads all the way into user experience and interaction design and all of these other things. And the ideas of cognitive science are really deep in this field. And from cognitive science, we're now in a world of neuroscience, where we can use magnetic resonance imaging to look at what's going on in the brain. And we see the brain light up, and we're told this fascinating, amazing story about everything that happens up in here. Like our man, sitting there at the desk, thinking deep thoughts. So this is the tale, right? Behaviorism to cognitivism to neuroscience, and again, we're just digging deeper and deeper and deeper into that thing we call the brain. So the answer to the question is, what is thinking? Our answer from all of this stuff is, it's stuff that happens in your head. That's the answer. And if we believe that this is the answer, I believe, and I'm going to give you a number of examples to try to convince you of this, that we as a field are doomed. Doomed to produce limited devices of limited capability. So, thinking. What is 34 plus 4? 38, right? You can do that in your head. Okay, what's 34 times 4? 136. What's 34 to the fourth power? If you get 1,336,366, I'm impressed. But most of you aren't going to do that. What are you going to do? You're going to use something. Some external device. It doesn't matter what you're doing, at some point, this fails you. At some point, you need to push beyond. We don't just build these to play games. We don't just build these to share stuff with our friends. We build them as an extension of ourselves. What is thinking? Let's ask instead, where does it happen? Where does it happen? It happens in the things that we make. This is a jigsaw puzzle. It's fairly simple. It's only got 200 pieces. Can you solve it? You can't solve it by looking at it, can you? I'll simplify. 20 pieces. Can you solve it? Of course not. 6 pieces. Can you solve it? You're looking, you're taking these pieces, you're doing some mental rotation. There's only 6 pieces. Shouldn't be too hard. It's tricky. You can't solve it. There's actually a piece missing. Something as simple as that, and you can't do it. But how could you solve it? You could move it with your hands, right? And you would figure it out pretty quickly, because the world is part of how you think. Just like when you play Scrabble. Right? If you play Scrabble, the best way to play Scrabble is not by sitting there and taking those 7 tiles and staring at them and trying to think of all the different word combinations. The best strategy, and there's research to prove it, take the tiles, move them around. You will come up with more word combinations in less time. Or what about this? You go into work, you're trying to solve some hairy problem, and you got all kinds of Post-it notes all over the wall, right? You stand back and look, hey, it's all accessible to your eyes. You can see everything. Why not just stand there and think? Why interact with the world at all? Because interaction is deep. Because interaction is part of how you think. 2 views here. On one side, I'll describe it as brain-bound. The idea that everything, thinking, cognition, all that stuff happens right here, up inside your head. Okay? On the other side, we have this idea that the mind extends out into the world. There's a famous paper. It's called The Extended Mind. It's a paper in philosophy, and there's a lot of other papers around, or a lot of other ideas around in the same space. But the notion here is that when you are working with things out in the world, right, it is not just your mind extends out into the world and is part of how you are thinking. This is known as what's called the Parity principle. If there is some process that works in a way that we would count as cognitive if it were done in the head, then we should count it as cognitive if it is done outside the head. So for example, I asked you to add 34 and 4. Do it in the head. But if you do it on paper, the traditional view would say, oh, well, it's just out there. It's not really thinking. What the extended mind view says is, it is thinking. Think about that in terms of all of the devices that you have in your life, all of the things that we make, right? We use it for this, and we use it for this. If we go further back, though, right, one of the more interesting things that we see is we see papers like this. So this is a paper called An Overview of the Epic Architecture for Cognition and Performance with Application to Human-Computer Interaction. I find this fascinating. Apparently, I don't have hands. I have manual motor processors. I don't have eyes. I have visual processors. Right? I don't have a mouth. I have a vocal motor processor. I have been decomposed, right? But this, 15 years ago, is leading work in human-computer interaction, trying to model people. Now, there is some definite elements to this that are really good, but it also takes a view that I stand here, and what I do is just outputs and inputs. Thinking happens here, and that's all. And what have we got? We've got a world in which the computer thinks we look like this. That's it. I got one finger, and boy, it's really great to slide that over a piece of glass, isn't it? When you work with things in the world, you use so much more than this. This is the future that we're moving towards, right? It's a future we have lots of words for it. ubiquitous computing, pervasive computing, wearable technology. Can we build that future with this? Can we build that future with this idea? Another example. All day long today, all day tomorrow, you are going to see people standing up here, and they are all going to have one thing in common. They're going to be doing stuff with their hands. Why? Why are we talking with our hands? When you're out in the hallway and you're having coffee with someone, you're going to be talking and gesturing with your hands. Why? A person can see you. They can hear your words. What's the point? What's the point? So, answer number one. You do it because it's extra information, just like talking more quietly or raising your voice. Same words, it adds something to the words, right? It adds to the message. It helps you communicate what you're getting across. And that is a fair answer, but it's not the whole story. Because why do you talk with your hands when you're on the phone? And you know that you do. Right? Now, a good answer there is it's a learned response, right? You're used to talking with other people, so when they're not there, it just kind of carries over. Again, it's a valid response. But what about two people who are blind talking to each other? Turns out people who have no sight and have been without sight since birth, have never actually seen a hand, use hand gestures all the time. So imagine person A talking to person B. Neither one of these people has seen a hand, but they're talking with their hands all the time. There's a few people who have been studying this. There's a woman at the University of Chicago. Her name is Susan Golden Meadow, and she has written a number of papers, dozens and dozens, an entire book on this. Her whole life's work has been about that question: why do people talk with their hands? And she has done all of these clever studies looking at how children talk with their hands and how grown-ups talk with their hands and how blind people and sighted people, and comparing them. And her conclusion for all of this comes down to this: gesturing does not merely reflect thought, it changes thought. By introducing action into one's mental representations, gesture forces people to think with their hands. And for the rest of this conference, you are never going to look at anyone's hands the same, right? You're going to be super conscious about people's hands and your own hands, right? Might this have some implication for designing gestural interfaces? Might it force us to go back and rethink this or this? Now, there are a lot of theories, a lot of fancy words that get thrown around. Maybe you've heard some of these: embodied cognition, distributed cognition, extended mind, cognitive integration, and action. There's a whole bunch of them. And they all come down to the same basic idea. To oversimplify, grossly oversimplify, in 3 words, Descartes was wrong. Right? That whole notion of mind-body dualism, which is sort of the foundation of modern Western philosophy and much of Western scientific thought, is a useful construct only up to a point. And then it begins to fail us. And as we get richer and richer interactive technologies, as we're trying to design for that, there are some deep, deep notions, so deep we don't even really see them, that are going to begin limiting us. They're going to make it harder for us to design and do the kind of work we want to do. Now, you don't need to buy into this all the way. All I wanted to suggest to you is that there's a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, we have the brain view. The idea that cognition happens in the head. And what you want to do is there's another end, and we can move towards the other side of that spectrum. And we are, right now, much further towards the brain side than the other side. And I want you to think about maybe you need to think about moving yourself a little more over this way. And if we do that, we're going to be seeing the world in a different way. Because you know what's happened in the last 20 years? You can sum it all up in digital, right? Everything in digital in the last 20 years can be summed up as web, mobile, and social. And what we've done is we have moved from the idea that computing happens when you are sitting down to it happens in your hand, when you're walking around. And that transition is only going to continue. It's only going to come more. Tomorrow we're going to hear a couple of talks. Scott Jensen's going to speak about beyond web and beyond mobile. In the afternoon, there's a couple of talks about the Internet of Things, and there's a talk about the best UI is no UI. All of these things are about moving beyond the technology world as we understand it, about bleeding computation into the world. And as part of that, we have to take a better, richer, more natural account of our bodies, our hands, how we position and how we live in the world and how we connect with all of those things. It means we need to begin rethinking what it means to think. Do you remember the game of Tetris? It's very simple, right? You got these blocks that fall down, and you can only do 4 things. You can take the block and you can move it left or right. You can rotate it by 90 degrees, or you can drop it into position. That's it. Very, very simple. Some cognitive scientists decided to study how people learn to play Tetris. They got people in, taught them to play the game, and set up some very careful keystroke level analysis to log all the keystrokes that people did, and watch them play Tetris for dozens and dozens of hours. So, according to classical cognitive science, here's what would happen. First thing you do, you make a lot of mistakes. You take that Tetris piece and you move it left 1, and then you move it left a second time, and then you think, uh-oh, that was wrong, so you move it back, right? You moved it 1, 2, 3, when you only needed to move it 1. That's a mistake. Or you take that piece and you rotate it, and then you rotate it again, and you think, oh, that's 1 rotation too far. I over-rotated. So then you have to rotate it again and keep going until you get it back into position. Classical theory tells us that as you become a better Tetris player and you become a more experienced Tetris player, that those extra translations left and right and those extra rotations will decrease. And since I'm telling you this story, you can guess what the actual answer is. They went up 10, 15%. In fact, the best players, the most skilled players, the ones who are really good at Tetris, they actually over-rotate the most. Why? Classical cognitive science, right? This notion that we think up here, that mental operations are stuff that happens in the head, classical science, cognitive science predicts that they go down. And they clearly did not. Why? Their answer was simple. When it comes to human action, we think of it as an output to cognition, and it's much, much more. They actually distinguish between 2 kinds of action. On the one hand, what they called pragmatic action. Pragmatic action is action that you take on the world to achieve a desired goal state. Oh, I'm thirsty. I move over. I've achieved my desired goal state of having a drink of water. If I had, say, knocked it over or tried to drink something else, right, that would have clearly been a mistake. But they pointed out that not all action is like that. A lot of action is what they called epistemic Epistemic as in epistemology, as in of or relating to knowledge. And the whole idea of epistemic action was to make mental computation faster, simpler, or to reduce the chance that you would make a mistake. This is easiest to understand if you think about playing chess. I've got a bishop. I want to move my bishop. I move my bishop, but I keep my finger on the bishop. And then when I do that movement, I think, uh-oh, that was a bad mistake. I'm going to lose. And I move it back. What do? I just pressed undo. Right? And in a classical view, what we would say, if the only idea we have of action is pragmatic action, right? I should learn not to do this. Right? Okay? But if it's an epistemic action, what I've done is I've changed the world because the point of an epistemic action is I'm not trying to change the world so much as I'm trying to bring about a change in myself. By doing that movement, I now begin to see the world in a different way, and then I go back and I've changed my understanding of the world. We do this all the time. What would happen if I move this a little bit to the left? Let's try making this a little bit bigger. No, let's make it a little bit smaller. You do epistemic actions all day long in your work. We all do it. This idea is not part of the standard canon for how we think about the way people think. We don't have a vocabulary for this. When you are watching, say, when you're doing a usability study or you're doing some user research and you're watching what people do, we tend to think of, well, I got to make sure they don't make mistakes. And the faster they get to this point, the fewer mistakes that they make, that's what I really want to do. But those can often be epistemic actions. We don't design for this. In other words, we don't design for how people really think. We don't design for the idea that we are embodied creatures that live in the world. We design for this. And this is changing. We design for a world where we want everything to be nice and neat and smooth and straight. But the reality is much more like this, isn't it? And we can't pretend that this second line here, as crazy as it is, isn't reality. Now, 25 years ago, Don Norman wrote a famous book, The Design of Everyday Things, which had a pretty big influence on a lot of people. It's probably the only book written before 1990 that everyone in this field should probably read, or, and if they haven't, should feel guilty about not reading it. It gave us a language around affordances, mental models, mapping, all kinds of things, and this has a broad, broad application. It also introduced this notion here of what's called the decision-action cycle. I don't know if you ever took this or remember this. The idea of the decision-action cycle was how and why do people act on the world? There are 7 stages, broken up into 2 sides. On the one side, we have the gulf of execution, it's called. If you take an introductory class on human-computer interaction, you will take this. Every textbook mentions it, right? The intention to act, you just determine a sequence of actions, and then you execute the action sequence, and then the world changes. Then we have what's called the gulf of evaluation. You perceive the state of the world, you interpret that perception, you evaluate it, and the loop goes around. Basically, what it says is this. Cognition is this really big and complicated piece, and the world is this really big and complicated piece. Action, just output. Perception is just input. That's what it really comes down to. And what I've tried to present to you today is a number of examples which show you that the reality is a lot more like this. Action is really big, perception is really big, and they all overlap, and it's much more complex. We see that when we play Tetris, when we solve a Jigsaw puzzle, and we need to start seeing it here. We need to think about the world a little bit more like the bottom, rather than forcing it to be that straight, neat line. Now, This. I love this picture. This is an iconic picture of Steve Jobs, right? This was a picture from Time magazine. It was the inset picture when the Macintosh was launched in 1984. And what does it tell us, right? This is the genius at home, right? Neat, clean, the embodiment, right? The embodiment of the computer world, the embodiment of good design. And if this is one of the most iconic pictures, this is my absolute rock bottom favorite. Steve Jobs at his home office. Do you notice anything? It's a freaking mess. This is where he really lived. This is where he worked. In fact, if you read the caption here, it says, "The genius in his labyrinth." You ever seen a workspace like this? Maybe it's called yours. Messy spaces are productive, and we know this. But instead, we have this idea that the digital world looks like this, and it should always look like this. It should be neat and clean and tidy. And that when we look at the way people interact with it, it should be neat and clean and tidy. But of course, it looks like this, doesn't it? I can't tell you how many times I've gone into people's offices and I've seen exactly this, right? I go to my parents' house and I see mess. I go to a study in anywhere, and you see this all over the place. This is how people actually work. And I'm not saying that we should let them work this way. I'm simply saying we need to account for it. Right now, we don't do a very good job of that. Because you know what? It's part of our work too. This is how we work, and we know it's valuable. This is how we think. Now, one of my brothers is an Arctic waterfowl ecologist. He lives in the Canadian Arctic, a place called Yellowknife. What it really means is he studies ducks in really cold places. And his world is completely different from ours. Because he is interested in understanding the natural world, right? He's a biologist, a natural scientist, and that means he's interested in the world as it is, or as it was. Right? That's not our world. We don't do natural things. We do unnatural things. We do artificial things. Everything in this room is artificial, even us. Right? This is a world that is designed. It is a world that is made, constructed by human beings for human needs, for human uses, for living life. There's the world of the duck, and the world of the phone, of the digital, and eventually everything else. Right? But if we're going to understand and really design this world, we still need to understand something about this world. We need to understand something about us as real people, not as these artificial ideas that we have, or these ideas that are somewhat correct and have gotten us a long ways, but are also incomplete. We live in a world of information with this massive, massive curve, right? That curve is so strong and has changed the world so much that when the Canadian novelist Douglas Coupland says you can have information or you can have a life, but you can't have both, we know he's telling the truth. But it's a world also that we've made, right? And that we need to keep making and remaking. Because the truth is, it's not just a world where information has taken off, but information and computation and devices and sensors and the number of people who depend on this every day for everything they do. And if we're really going to design for people, not users, like we heard this morning, right? We should begin understanding people as people and how they think. We've always been doing this. The whole history of this field, we can trace it right back to clay tablets, information. And we have gotten really good at making things for creating and distributing and publishing and collecting and searching and consuming information. And those tools have certainly helped us think. Think better, think different, think more. But there is much more to be done. Much more. How do we help people really think? Can we build tools that really do that? Because at the end of the day, information is cheap and understanding is expensive. And if we're going to build the digital future, we need to recognize that interaction is deep.